Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual conversation brought to you by the Making the Shift in Conversation series. Making the Shift is a youth homelessness social innovation lab that funds, conducts, prototypes, and mobilizes cutting-edge research to prevent and end youth homelessness in Canada. MTS is funded by the Government of Canada's Networks of Centres of Excellence program. You can visit our website at makingtheshiftinc.ca for more info. Our hashtag for today's event is MTS in Convo, and we'll be retweeting content from that conversation. You can follow us at the Homeless Hub as well. So this is a listen in only webinar. So if you have questions for our panelists, please type them into the question box in the control panel on your screen. We'll also host a Q&A in the second half of the webinar. We also have enabled closed captioning, which you will also see in the control panel on your screen. You can follow along with live notes if you click on Custom Live Streaming Service at the top left of your screen. If you experience any technical issues, please send us a message through the questions box and we'll get back to you. We will be recording today's webinar and you will receive a follow-up email with the link. Before we begin, it is our custom in Canadian universities to acknowledge the land on which we work, study, and live. Since this meeting is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations in Canada and across the world. There are few places on Earth that someone before us has not called home. As Making the Shift is hosted at York University in Toronto, we would like to share the land acknowledgement that is used at York University, and we invite all guests who are joining us today to consider their own position with regard to the land where they find themselves. Making the Shift acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Okay, and now we're going to hand it over to David French from Away Home Canada to introduce our guests today. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the talk.
Yes, thank you, April, and thank you for all the attendees for being here. This is an important space to be in, and I'm privileged to have been given the opportunity and permission to help steer this conversation and allow for the time and space for these two national and international leaders to speak to their work. We're going to grill them with some questions if we have time afterwards as well. But I will introduce our two speakers, Dr. Melanie Doucette and Dr. Michael Unger. I'm a huge fan of both of them. I first met Michael Unger in 2005, actually, at an international conference that we put on at the Alberta government. And so I've been a long supporter of his work for this time, and I've been reintroduced to Dr. Doucette through our work with the Child Welfare League of Canada. And so we both have really important messages to share today and important grounding spaces for the space that we're in with respect to specific to youth transitions. And not only has the pandemic kind of elevated the realities of what this means for young people transitioning from care, but there's been many people before us that have advocated in this space around transitions. And I feel as if we are in a moment and in a time where we can really harness and leverage this opportunity around the pandemic to think about equity-based approaches, rights-based approaches for young people transitioning from care, and what that means with respect to how do we integrate data, how do we blend and harmonize community and government systems together, and both Dr. Doucette and Dr. Unger will speak to those opportunities moving forward. And so enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Doucette first, and then we'll hear from Dr. Unger. Be back in a minute.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar. My name is Melanie Doucette, Dr. Melanie Doucette, and I am a senior researcher and project manager at the Child Welfare League of Canada currently, and I'm also a researcher at the Center for Research on Children and Families at McGill University, as well as a Making the Shift postdoc scholar with lived experience. And I'm coming to you from Montreal, which is located on traditional and unceded Mohawk territory. Do I pass it on to Dr. Unger for him to introduce himself, or do I start the presentation now? Okay. All right. So if we could have the slides up, thank you. So today I'm going to give you a short presentation on the realities of the pipeline from child welfare to youth homelessness for youth in care across Canada. And we'll have a Q&A period at the end, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as well. So I want to differentiate between homelessness and houselessness because they mean two very different things. So having a house, a physical structure over your head, a place where you can sleep at night, does not automatically make a home. And I think that's very important when we think about the experiences of youth in care while they're in the child welfare system. Because oftentimes they do have a placement, either foster care or a group home, sometimes in an institution, but that does not necessarily make it a home. When we talk about homelessness prevention, I think it needs to be rooted in relationships, in community, in culture, in belonging, and as well as healing, so that youth can feel a sense of home, which oftentimes is not something that they get to achieve during their time in care. A lot of young people move around a lot. I think the average placement is about 5 or 6 placements for young people in care. And that doesn't create a sense of stability. It doesn't create a sense of feeling at home. And so I think this is something that also follows young people after they exit the child welfare system at age of majority, that sense of homelessness, of not having a home, even if you do have a roof over your head, can create long-lasting effects and impacts. I think it's also important for us to think about the Indigenous youth experience of homelessness, and that it has to take into account the systemic separation that happens through their child welfare involvement from their communities of origin, from their families, from their culture, from the land. So it's not just, again, a lack of having a roof over your head. There's so much more that comes into homelessness when it comes to youth in care and Indigenous youth in care as well. I would recommend that you look up the work that's been done by Jesse Thistle with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness on the Indigenous definition of homelessness for further information on that. So we're going to view a video which was part of my doctoral research project titled Relationships Matter for Youth Aging Out of Care. And I think it really summarizes quite well why we're seeing these outcomes of young people transitioning out of the child welfare system at age of majority and experiencing homelessness right after they age out. So we'll view this video and then I'll get into a little bit more context afterwards.
Think about your turning of age birthday. Were you ready to be a fully self-sufficient adult? Think back to when you first moved out of your parents' home. Were you able to return if you needed a place to stay or a place to spend the holidays? Were you able to count on them and maintain a relationship after you moved out?
When I was younger and while I was in ministry care, I was separated from my sisters, so I basically aged out on my own in separate towns of my family.
For youth in long-term care, this is their reality. If they are unable to find forever homes during their time in care, they must rapidly transition to adulthood at the young age of 18 or 19, with no option to return in times of crisis.
Because of that, I ended up homeless. I was lucky enough to find places, find roommates, but it didn't really turn out the way that it should have when I turned 19.
This is due to provincial legislation across Canada mandating child welfare agencies to release youth from their care at the age of majority. This contrasts with the experience of their peers, who tend to stay at home up until the age of 29 and continue to rely on their families, friends, and communities throughout their adult lives. Due to this cutoff of supports, youth exiting care tend to have limited support networks, and most of the connections made during their time in care are formal, paid for, and have an expiry date. This is despite research indicating that supportive long-term relationships can act as a bridge during this difficult transition. Research also illustrates that the status quo is not working. Most young people exiting care are at high risk of experiencing multiple difficulties. Child welfare decision-making often does not include youth in care's perspectives, and their voices are often left out.
Children and youth in care are rarely asked for their input when the decision to remove them from their homes and their family of origin is made. We have no options to choose for ourselves and have no control over the direction our life is taking. These practices need to change, and children and youth from care need to be involved in all decision-making discussions.
This collaborative For a Voice research project aimed to take a closer look through the power of images and accompanying captions at the relationships that matter to youth from care and how those relationships can be developed, nurtured, and sustained over time in a healthy way.
I hope that people really, after this exhibit, realize that foster youth are also living, breathing people that have personalities.
Preliminary results showcase the need for broadening the definition of family to include pets and parent-like mentors, and broadening the definition of community to include online forms of connection. Connections to spirituality, culture, and the land were also identified as important, especially for racialized and Indigenous youth.
For our dear young ones that are in foster care right now, we ask a blessing for them. We want to carry a good vision that we're all part of a family, and we realize it and we recognize it and we feel the love and the kindness and the warmth of a family, all of us.
As a former youth in care myself, this project is close to my heart. Through our collaborative research, my co-researchers and I aim to showcase that youth in and from care have a basic need for connection to others, just like their peers do.
Forming relationships with youth in and from care so that our relationships with the system are not devoid of warmth and understanding.
We should also be given the opportunity, as part of our healing journey, to make connections with those people who will have positivity in our lives and help us build social capital.
As human beings, we cannot and should not have to exist self-sufficiently and independently from others. Our peers who are not in care are not expected to age out of their families at the age of majority and continue to rely on others throughout their adulthood. This is simply a normal part of life for them. However, youth in and from care are taught to become self-sufficient as they prepare to age out of the system, which imposes a lot of stress on them as they deal with yet another drastic transition in their lives.
After we transition, we should be able to keep, these long-term relationships that we have built in the system, regardless of who they were with. Like, your counselor or people that you met, in your group homes, or, not have restrictions on, housing or based around even your pets.
To keep our inner fire alive, we need to be interconnected to others who can help us thrive within our communities. We need to be provided with the same level of ongoing care, support, and love that our peers receive, so we can get a fighting chance to thrive and not just survive.
Thank you. So, I just want to briefly talk about, oh, I'm not sure what's happening here. I just want to briefly talk about my own experience from aging out of care, because I do have lived experience in the foster care system. I'm originally from New Brunswick, where I was in care during my teenage years. And I aged out at age 18 to go to university a couple of hours away from my hometown. And during this time, I experienced a lot of housing instability. I moved around at least 4 times during that year. So the instability that I experienced during my time in the system, which I lived in 6 different placements in 4 years while I was in the child welfare system, continued with me after I aged out of care. I had to do some couch surfing when I was in between places. I had to access the food bank because I was living in poverty. And that's something that's very much a reality for many youth in care who age out of the system and don't have that forever home that a lot of young people who either get adopted or are able to reunite with their biological families have. And oftentimes we age out with no savings account, no real, financial foundation for us to start our young adult lives out of poverty. So we're propelled right away into poverty, living below the poverty line. And it creates this cycle that's really difficult to get out of. So for me, I was able to access a post-secondary education program that was established in 1999. So a year after I aged out, I was already a year into university, and things that were really tough for me. I was really struggling. I wasn't sure if I was able to continue with my program and to continue into my second year. And in 1999, the New Brunswick government decided to establish this program that funds your first degree up to age 24, and it doesn't matter whether it's a college or university, and they cover everything from housing, rent, bills, food, books, tuition, everything. So you don't have to worry about trying to make ends meet while you're completing your education. And this really turned things around for me. Luckily for me, I was always good at school. That was one of my strong points and one of my points of resilience. So this is something that really, really helped me and turned things around completely for me. And one of the reasons why I'm here speaking to you today, that support was really crucial for me in my life. So when we talk about the realities today, yes, a lot has changed since the late 90s when I aged out, but some things haven't. And that's really not okay. Young people are still aging out of care and into poverty and homelessness today. So when we think about the situation, like the video mentioned, of young Canadians between the ages of 20 and 29, what their realities are is that most of them, nearly half, are still living with their parents. And youth aging out of care don't have that option. They lose abruptly basic supports and services due to this age-based legislated cutoff, regardless if they're ready and if they have the support system to do so successfully or not. So like I mentioned, this propels young people into a life of housing insecurity and poverty right from the get-go. And like we saw in the video, research has shown that young people from care are very highly likely to experience homelessness compared to their peers who aren't in care. And Indigenous and LGBTQ+ youth have an even higher risk of experiencing these negative outcomes. So this is something that really needs to be addressed, and that can't continue. So next slide, please. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some national work that I've been part of since the beginning of the pandemic. So we decided to start meeting at the beginning of March 2020 when the pandemic restrictions started, as a way to advocate together our concern for young people who are currently in care and aging out during a pandemic. So we decided to mobilize and call ourselves the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates, and we're comprised of various youth and care networks from across the country and youth-led organizations. So a lot of people with lived experience who are now running peer support organizations and youth and care networks across the country, as well as some key ally organizations such as the Child Welfare League of Canada and Away Home Canada. So David sits on the National Council as well as a key ally. And we first convened out of emergency and kind of really crucial concern about youth having to age out during the pandemic. And we advocated quite quickly for moratoriums on aging out of care during the pandemic, and implored the various provincial and territorial governments to issue moratoriums so that youth wouldn't have to age out during a pandemic. And we were quite successful in being able to get several jurisdictions to jump on board. Next slide, please. So this map needs to be updated, and I'll give you the link to our webpage in the chat after my presentation has been concluded, just so that you can view the updated webpage, because some things have changed since I prepared the presentation. But as you can see, quite a few jurisdictions did issue moratoriums for aging out during the pandemic up until the end of the pandemic, or they have expiration dates. So if you look at this map, you'll notice that in BC, they have moratoriums in place specifically related to temporary housing supports and the agreements with young adults, extended post-care supports. And they have been extended up until the fall for the AYA of this year, and March of next year for the temporary housing agreements. In Manitoba, we just recently found out that they extended up until September of 2021, so this year. And Saskatchewan is also in September of this year. In Ontario, they actually went further and announced that they would extend those moratoriums up until September of 2022 to give proper time for an alternate plan to be in place that wouldn't cast out young people from the system before they're ready to transition to adulthood. New Brunswick also has moratorium, and it was also extended recently, actually last week, I think we found out, up until September of this year. And Nova Scotia did have an informal one that was in place, but we have not heard if it was extended. As far as we know, it expired in March of this year. As you can also see, some jurisdictions chose to not implement moratoriums, either because they had a very low amount of young people aging out during the pandemic. For example, in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And in Quebec, they decided that they would not issue a moratorium because there's a few words in the legislation that allows young people to shelter in place during times of crisis. However, what we're hearing from the ground and from our National Council members from Quebec is that this is not being applied for most young people in care in Quebec, and that they're still being asked to age out. And the age to age out in Quebec is 18 years old, and we have very little to none post-care supports available to those young people. So they're aging out in very dangerous and precarious conditions. Next slide, please. So I'm sharing here a painting that was submitted for a project that I'm currently leading called the Youth and Care Matter Project. And it's examining the experiences of youth who are aging out of the child welfare system during the pandemic. And it's an arts-based digital project. Deanna decided to submit a painting and called it In My Mind. And I will read the caption that accompanies her painting. Being in care is already so traumatic, but during the pandemic, I was aged out of care without the acknowledgement of the March 2021 rule. Without the help of my social workers, I don't have the funds to get everything I need. They paid for my prescriptions and housing. Now I need to decide if I want my prescriptions or a room and my phone, but without my sleeping pills, I don't sleep, which messes with my mental health. Then I start overthinking, which I could end up getting bad grades. So this young person was from a province where there was a moratorium in place, and she was not informed of this. Her social worker did not inform her that this was an option, and she was told to age out anyway. So I had to connect this young person with the Youth and Care Network in her province so that they could assist her with this, because she shouldn't have aged out. So even the jurisdictions that have moratoriums in place right now, it's still not, the directive is still not being applied consistently across the board, and it's not translating from the top to the front line in most cases. Next slide, please. So while the council was successful in securing temporary moratoriums in a lot of jurisdictions, it is a temporary measure, and we don't want to return to the status quo that existed pre-COVID once the pandemic crisis is over. And we're already starting to see reopening plans that are being discussed and announced in the various jurisdictions across Canada. And the federal government often talks about this new normal that we're going to be entering post-pandemic. And youth and care also deserve this new normal. We can't be returning to the things that were in place before, because they were not acceptable and not ethical for young people. So as the council, we are now thinking about a post-pandemic recovery plan for young people in care, and one that is focused on a sense of being supported and feeling ready for the transition to adulthood, rather than this arbitrary and discriminatory age cutoff that's currently in the legislation. Next slide, please. So in October of last year, we released as the council, and I led the writing of this report, a report called A Long Road Paved with Solutions. I'll send you again the link in the chat after the presentation component has concluded, just in case you want to go read it. In this report, we summarized key recurring recommendations on aging out of care that were put forward by youth and from care, youth and care networks, advocates, and researchers across the country since the late 80s. So what we found was that there were over 75 reports since 1987, with over 435 concrete recommendations for change to child protection policy and practice targeted to the transition to adulthood for young people in care. And so the solutions have been provided by young people with lived experience and by advocates. And it's way overdue for the government to start paying attention to those solutions. And I think it's also important for them to listen to the expertise of people with lived experience, because these are the people that know what works and what doesn't. And I think that's the road to better policy and better practice. Next slide, please. So in this report, we highlighted 5 key recurring recommendations that were being highlighted across these 75 plus reports. So one of them was to create national standards for transitions from care, because that's something that currently doesn't exist in Canada, and we're one of the few Western countries that don't have some sort of national framework or national policy when it comes to young people's transitions to adulthood from the child welfare system. Another recommendation was to extend the transition period for transitioning to adulthood and provide developmentally appropriate supports. And this was deemed as an immediate and short-term solution, while more systemic reform was underway. A third recommendation is to implement an exiting care framework that's centered on interdependence. And that's something that was highlighted in the video that we saw earlier as well, was that currently the exiting care framework is focused on independent living and autonomy. And really, that's not realistic. That's not how things work in real life for young people who aren't in care. And young people in care should be provided with those same opportunities to be connected to people who care about them throughout their lives, and to be connected to their communities as well in an interdependent way, so a give and take relationship. Another recommendation was to implement a housing first for youth strategy. So to have housing specifically reserved and targeted for young people who are aging out of care, and with holistic services and supports. And the fifth one is to eliminate age-based discrimination of child protection services by implementing readiness-based transitions to adulthood. And this requires systemic reform. So to eliminate this age cutoff at age of majority and really allow individual youth to transition as they are ready, no matter what age they are. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to focus on 2 of those 5 recommendations just for the purposes of this presentation. So the Housing First for Youth strategy was one of the recurring recommendations that were coming out of these reports, where people were recommending that we allocate housing specifically for young people aging out of care, and supported by holistic programs that address the root causes of housing insecurity and that foster youth resilience, such as education and employment support, mental health and addiction services, and the creation of long-term supportive social networks. So again, housing first doesn't necessarily mean just a roof over your head. It entails so much more than that. It has to be a holistic approach, and it has to be a relation-based approach as well. And the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home Canada has a program model guide for this Housing First for Youth model that can be adapted to young people from care. Next slide, please. So as the National Council, we are currently working on these national standards that were recommended as part of those 5 key recommendations. And we are developing what we call equitable standards for transitions to adulthood for young people in care. So as I mentioned earlier, there's currently no federal or jurisdictional legislative framework for the provision of transition supports and services for teenagers in care. And currently, we don't have a national data collection system or reporting regarding the types of services and supports that are provided, the quality, the efficacy. And so we don't really have an accountability process for transitions to adulthood for young people from care. And it also differs very much in terms of what province or territory a young person lives in, and sometimes even from region to region within that province. So if they're in an urban or rural setting, in terms of the types of post-care supports that they have access to. And even in the jurisdictions that have the most post-care supports, like BC, for example, there are so many eligibility criteria and deadlines and paperwork to fill out that most young people actually don't even get to access those post-care types of supports and services. There was a study done by the Tyee, which is a BC-based newspaper, that looked at how many youth were actually receiving these post-care supports and services in BC, and they found that only 1/3 of the population that ages out of care every year, which is about 1,000 youth per year, was accessing those types of post-care services because of the eligibility criteria, basically setting up young people to not be able to keep up with the programs or not even being able to access them in the first place. So that needs to change. So like I mentioned, multiple reports have called for this national framework to be put in place so that no matter where you live as a young person in care, no matter what province, territory, or region, that you have access to these very basic minimum standards before you're asked to age out of the child welfare system. So we want to really focus on this for the next few months. Our ultimate goal is really to ensure that young people are provided with the basic minimum of what's required for them to thrive, because right now what they're provided with is not sufficient and is propelling them into situations of marginalization and poverty and homelessness. And really we want to shift that around so that young people are fully supported and have every chance to be able to succeed as young adults. So as the National Council, we started having consultations amongst ourselves in the fall after we released the report. So in November, we had a couple of brainstorm sessions in terms of what these standards would look like. And we came up with these 8 transition to adulthood pillars. So under each pillar, there are concrete things that need to be put in place And so I'll just present to you the 8 pillars for now. Stay tuned for the full document, which will be released at some point in the fall. We did recently get funding from the Max Bell Foundation and the North Pine Foundation to continue work on this. So the first pillar is financial support. Like I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a foundation of financial support so that young people aren't propelled into living in poverty as soon as they turn 18 or 19. So this is something that's really important. Education and professional development is also super important. That certainly was very important for me and my trajectory. Housing is another component. And like I mentioned, we're looking at the Housing First for Youth strategy as a potential program to implement. And relationships, again, this has to be the core of every type of support and service that you provide, because relationships really help young people to be able to have that safety net and that support network to turn to in times of crisis, but also in times of, success, so that they're able to celebrate milestones, celebrate their successes with people who care about them and feel a sense of belonging. Culture and spirituality was also something that we decided is a very important pillar and that often doesn't get focused on during young people's time in care, especially for racialized young people in care. And that's something that came up in the video that we saw earlier as well. And it's very much connected to, the sense of feeling at home, to be able to be connected to your culture, to your community of origin, and to be able to practice your religion or spirituality. Health and well-being is another one that we determined was really important, because a lot of times what happens for young people in care is that they lose all those supports, those health supports. For example, oftentimes when you're in care, you have health coverage for your prescriptions, and we saw that in the painting that Deanna shared, and that ends as soon as you age out of care, and you're kind of left to your own to either have to pay out of your pocket for the prescriptions or to figure out some sort of other coverage. Oftentimes that just isn't a possibility for young people aging out of care. And so if you're, on mental health, prescriptions, that can be detrimental to your ability to function. For example, trans youth who are taking hormone replacement therapy, that can also end as soon as you age out of care and can definitely really affect your mental health and your transition progress. So this is something that we deem as very, very important for young people in care. Another element is advocacy and rights. So being able to know as a young person in care what your rights are and who to report things that are unethical and unprofessional to when they do happen, and also being able to advocate for yourself and for others in care through connecting to youth and care networks and having that sense of community with other people who have lived experience as well can be really life-changing. It certainly was for me when I started getting involved in advocacy. And knowing my rights while I was in care would have really helped me to be able to detect when certain things that happened to me while I was in care by some social workers were unethical, and I would have known to report it at the time. That's only something that I learned further on in my young adulthood years. And the 8th pillar is emerging adulthood development. So this is something that we've come to learn in terms of the research that's been coming out in terms of adolescent development. And emerging adulthood has come out as a developmental phase in a young person's life between the ages of 19 and 29, where they're still in that discovery period. They're still figuring out who they are, their identity, what they want to do, and that period is very much necessary to be able to have stability as an older adult and to have a successful career trajectory, for example. So this is something that really needs to be an option for young people in care, and currently it is not, because they have to age out at 18 or 19. They don't get to experience emerging adulthood. They just go straight into full-fledged adulthood when they're not ready to do so. So they need to be provided with that longer transition period so that they can figure out what it is that they're good at and what they are interested in and what paths that they want to pursue in terms of career. So I do want to mention before I conclude my part of the presentation that one of our council, two of our council members actually from Ontario, the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition and Youth in Care Canada have recently announced a partnership with the ministry in Ontario and the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada to develop and implement a readiness-based model for youth in care transitions to adulthood. And we're really excited that Ontario is taking the lead in this area. Our work at the national level with these equitable standards that I'm presenting now aims to complement that work that Ontario is currently doing, and to also advocate for similar initiatives to be implemented in other provinces and territories, so that this should be something that provinces and territories take the initiative on.
So it seems like we might be having some technical difficulties. I'm wondering, Michael, I know you were gonna add some thoughts at the end of Melanie's presentation, so maybe we can just jump to that section.
Sure, that's all. Oh, Melanie, I hope we can get her. Dr. Doucette is, it's such an amazing presentation. I was simply going to reflect very briefly. If you can hear me fine, I take it technically we're okay. Teresa? Yep.
Yeah, we're all good. And I'll work to get Melanie back on.
Dr. Doucette will be able to rejoin us. But I mean, the theme she raises about that there was a pipeline, that there's so many initiatives, and there have been far too many reports on the same topic, reiterating the same points over and over. Indeed, so my own work on resilience has sort of shown these same sort of themes of need for control and stable housing and continuity of relationships and attachments. She's said it so incredibly well. I don't want to necessarily repeat that. Instead, if I might, I just wanted to talk just for a couple of minutes about research and how it's very powerful to have the participatory action research models that Dr. Doucette has been using. And there's some building on sort of the shoulders of that, if you will. There's myself and my team, and I know many others, we're beginning to also ask or use mixed methods, longitudinal studies, to try and figure out how we can actually change the course of this, of course, as people work on the advocacy. So, I mean, just to give you an example, a large study funded through the MTS network funding that we're doing in Nova Scotia is asking a slightly different question. I mean, the common question, of course, is why do young people end up precariously housed? And our question is more on the resilience side. And so we're also asking the question concurrently with that, what happens that many young people do come out of the child welfare system and don't end up precariously housed? So in studying resilience, or this kind of what's sometimes referred to as positive deviance, what we're actually trying to also figure out is what is going on for young people as they move through the system. So we've designed a study of 14 to 17-year-olds. We have a very strong partnership with the government of Nova Scotia, specifically the Department of Community Services and the Deputy Minister here. And what we've been implementing, though the study has pandemic put quite a wrench in actually getting started, but at least we're moving in the right direction, and we have all the legal and the ethics figured out and everything's figured out. And we're just about to do the recruitment of nominating youth into the study. And our idea is that if we actually followed several hundred young people through those final years of their placement, involvement with child welfare, that we would actually be able to then look at these critical turning points about when exactly they make that decision, or when is a critical break in relationships, or indeed, when is there a critical attachment? And Dr. Doucette, I see you're back. I'm just want to make sure. sure they just invited me if I just kind of jump in here with the technical
Yeah,
problem.
of course. I don't know what happened. I just got like kicked off and everything shut down. So my apologies, but at least I was literally at the last word of my presentation. So thank you for taking it over. And I don't know what happened, but I'm back. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have a Q&A here in just a couple of minutes, but I just want to say that. So what we did was with the 14 to 17-year-olds, we're going to be tracking them and following them as as much as we possibly can. It's a mixed method study, so there will be a qualitative component trying to understand the trends as it emerges in the quantitative data. And of course, and the other maybe slightly controversial but very innovative thing that we have done in other studies is we actually go back to the files with the permission, of course, of the youth. And we're not looking at the nitty gritty of the details. What we're looking at is the critical junctures. This young person was referred at age 8 for this service. There was a report done, but the report never really influenced the case plan. Okay, you go on, right? You look at the child moved to another place. You looked at how many workers the child had, how many schools they changed. I mean, one thing I sometimes wish that we could actually move from the abstractions down to those more actually tracking what happened to a young person. And maybe, just maybe, if in combination of the longitudinal quantitative data and this more fine-tuned qualitative data of engaging in conversations with young people and having them interpret our data, but also actually looking at their files and seeing if cumulatively, when you look at, say, 60 young people and all their different transitions and the engagements with the different systems, if you could actually get down to that level, then I think we'd actually begin to sort of see when does a youth track towards being precariously housed, and when do they track towards some sort of stability? But I can tell you, if I might, just in maybe this little closed bubble that we're in here right now, is it's a tough one to sell to governments to actually do that file review. It's one thing to talk in the abstraction. It's another to actually go back and say, yeah, look at all those missed opportunities, or hopefully look at those wonderful, good casework management that actually occurred where a child was heard, their voice was listened to, and they actually got a service and done in a way that they particularly wanted. That can be a very, very difficult part of this kind of research, but it's ultimately what we need, this combination of good longitudinal data to see those transitions and a more fine-tuned analysis of what actually happens in these young people's lives. If we're going to actually look at why a lot of young people go this way and some end up in more precarious housing. So with that, I'll pass it back to David.
Yes, and I want to pass it back to Dr. Doucette to make sure you have any final closing comments around your presentation and Michael's comments.
Yeah, my apologies. I'm not sure what happened, technical glitch. But yeah, basically I was cut off at my very last word as I was going to pass it on to Dr. Unger. But I do think that governments have responsibility towards young people in care, because when they take them into care, they become, the ministry becomes the legal guardian of those young people, and therefore adopts the role of parent. And as parent, you're supposed to provide, for your children as best as you can, and also support them as they become, young adults. And so I think that whole cutoff at age of majority needs to be reexamined and needs to be changed, because that's not how parents treat their children, in real life. They don't get disowned by their families at age of majority. They continue, to receive, maybe not as much as when they were like younger, but they continue to receive some form of support while they figure out their place in society and, what they want to do with their life. And I think the government has a responsibility to be good parents. And right now, the way that it's legislated, they just are not for adolescents in care.
Yeah, brilliant segue. And, I think both of you have raised these important items that speak to the importance of understanding not only how good a job you've done with transitions, but also where perhaps there were failed intersections. And that's what we're talking about with respect to transitions. And it isn't about to reflect on the poor transitions. We also want to see this pathway, as you've said, Dr. Unger, around how young people path towards success, path towards resilience, and path towards independence, whatever independence means. And we have to be thinking about transitions through a lens of potential reductions in future burdening of social systems also. And so what does that mean? What tools do young people need at that transition period? And as we think about blending and harmonizing data and or government and community systems to ensure that they have all those tools that they need. We know that governments can't do all the work, and we have to rely on community partners to be engaging in some of those transition elements that are super critical. And so in saying that, much of this work relies on good quality research. Much of this work will rely also on larger systems change in governments. But in your opinions, what can community and community partners do and be doing in helping to sort of move the needle on thinking differently about transitions?
Melanie, you want to?
Yeah, well, I would say like the community has been involved and has been doing a lot of work. A lot of, the supports that happen for young people who experience homelessness falls on the community. And I do think there's a lot of offloading that currently happens instead of a real partnership from government and community. And I think that has to change. And I do think it has to be like a holistic kind of, partnership and network instead of just kind of passing the hot potato, which is kind of what I call that, where it's people, just passing it on because no one wants to really fully deal with it and take responsibility. I think it has to be a community effort. And when I say community, I mean all the stakeholders involved. And I do think that youth and care networks, which are, very much grassroots, community oriented and community based, have been doing this work, as we saw in the report that I quickly summarized in the presentation. They have been providing the solutions. They have been doing the advocacy work. So I think, connecting to those existing organizations, to the youth and care networks that exist would be a good start. For anyone that is interested in, supporting this issue and doing something about it, connect to those youth and care networks because they've been doing the work for decades and continue to do the work and it's young people with lived experience who are doing this work. So that's what I have to say.
I just simply add, I sometimes wonder about the randomness of it. And it really would be nice if we could elevate this conversation a little bit to a little bit more sense of what predicts, like what profile of young person requires what kind of community support. Do you ever get the feeling, I mean, maybe this is just my gut experience, but whenever I worked in settings like this, that it's kind of random. Like, okay, I live in Kenora, or I live in Halifax, and a kid's coming out, and well, we have the Boys and Girls Clubs locally, or we have that volunteer, and so they get that. And like you ever feel like you're just kind of on a big roulette wheel, and it's like whatever sort of whatever number comes up, and it's like we just jettison. It's not how we do things like cognitive, if you have trauma, we have cognitive behavioral therapies, which are highly scripted and everything else. And you get into this zone of helping in a very complex problems. And then we just become completely anecdotal, random, whatever's on whoever my person I happen to like in my community you're referred to. And I don't think I'm totally stretching that a little bit, that it's like we jettison the science. We don't really know that, okay, well, this profile with this trauma past, with this particular kind of lack of attachments would probably benefit most from the kind of mentorship you get in this kind of structured environment. And then we sort of create it or seek it out, and we demonstrate to government a return on investment that says, look, take the $10,000 that you're about to spend on something really, for this kid this way, and let's really invest in hiring or creating this way. That kind of intentionality in design, we are still, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think we're a long way from that.
Yeah, and sorry, I just wanted to, because this ties into the standards, right? Or the lack thereof, the lack of standards. So when you don't have those in place in a concrete way, that is like Russian roulette, where it's like you get what is there and it's totally based on luck instead of guaranteed access. It's based on if you have a supportive social worker who has the time to go the extra mile for you to make recommendations, or if you're well connected to your community, if people understand you and like you, there's just so much chance, that's left to chance, instead of just guaranteed like basic support and access to services as you're transitioning to adulthood. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve with these standards, to say like, don't leave it up to just randomness or to, you know, how well you're connected or how lucky you are to have a good social worker. You know, every young person should have those basic things in place, no matter their circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And what the standards also do, if I can speak to those quickly, is it offers up a lens towards how this can be approached from a whole of government approach versus just a children's services or a child intervention approach. And we've been saying that for a long time around youth homelessness. The issue of youth homelessness and the responsibility of youth homelessness does not rely on one single department. And that is much the same as transitions. We can't suggest that this is all the responsibility of a child welfare department in each province, because there are elements and there are bridges that happen, actually tangible and purposeful bridges that happen between government systems for young people transitioning from care. Those could be tightened up as well. But again, if we understand, again, I'll be a bit more forthright. There are no surprises in young people who transition from care. We know exactly when it's going to happen. So that suggests too that you've got runway to plan for it. And so if we think about creating a solution where you can, in that period of time, bridge community systems and government systems together so that you do get to this point where it doesn't become random, Dr. Unger, it becomes very purposeful and very planned. And as that young person said in your video, Dr. Doucette, it engages them in those solutions and those decisions that are being made with them, not for them or on their behalf. It is with them and in harmony. And so the standards also speak to that. And so if I can, you've both been doing this for a long time and you've both had success across a number of different streams of this work. So what, in your experience, has been, what catches the attention of governments the best in thinking about how do we further position their role within this space around, you know, new practice and policy standards for transitions?
I'm gonna simply say that I find the right balance seems to be some really beautiful little charts with lots of tables and an N of 1. Most policy is never set by those charts. My experience is that policy is set by an N of 1. That single case that captures the national attention, unfortunately, often tragically rather than positively. But there's something that inspires change and it can actually sway. I mean, and there's historic examples of that. The picture of Kim Phuc, that the girl in the picture running from a napalm attack in 1974, she's now a Canadian citizen, that helped change the course of the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, in our own time, Alan Kurdi and the picture of a tragic death of a 3-year-old on the beaches of Turkey trying to reach a Syrian refugee trying to reach Greece. And each of those tragically creates an N of 1 where you see a shift in national or international policy. It's awful that it takes, but there's also inspiring ones, right? That we can actually see, you know, people who have made it through the system and done exceptionally well. I think I'm looking at one, if I might. You know, I think if we kind of understand some of those stories, so the N of 1 plus maybe the data that justifies the expenditure.
I agree that right now, any systemic change that happens is reactionary instead of preventative. And oftentimes it's a reaction to a scandal rather than looking at, oh, this is something that's going well, let's support that more, right? So, you know, there's been a lot of deaths that have happened across Canada of young people who either have committed suicide shortly after aging out or just before aging out, or who have died of an overdose. And this is something that keeps happening over and over again. Alex Gervais was a young person in British Columbia who committed suicide just a few months before aging out of care from his supervised hotel room placement that he was in. And in New Brunswick, Ashley Smith was another kind of failure from the government, where she ended up committing suicide inside of an adult penitentiary after spending most of her teenage years, in a revolving door of criminal justice system involvement that was really mental health issues that were left unaddressed. So to me, I think we need to shift from that. We need to be focusing on how do we prevent that from ever happening again. Like, to me, it's not something that has been the focus. It runs, its course. There's a tension, and then it drops from, the priorities, the political priorities. So I think we need to look at, what can we do to better support young people so that they are achieving success, so that they are thriving, they are blossoming, and how can we shift from this crisis management or crisis intervention focus to one that's really about nurturing and about fostering resilience, instead of saying, oh, well, you have to be resilient despite, the system. No, it's the system responsibility to foster, resilience in young people, not the other way around. And I think young people are simply tired. Young people from CARE are simply tired of hearing about, oh, you're so resilient. Look at you, the ones that are achieving well despite the system. And they're like, the system should have been helping me become resilient instead of me trying to figure it out on my own and surviving and having to become tough and rough. That's not how things should be going for our young people. And I think we need to take this opportunity, as we're coming out of a pandemic, to really change things for the better.
Agreed. We've got some excellent questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to try and paraphrase some of them. One of them, the first one being, and Bill, you nailed it, and I've always thought this, that there's a disconnect sometimes between the frontline service providers or the workers and the policy that's developed. How do you bridge those gaps in the realities that individuals are facing on the ground, despite the innovations that are happening, despite maybe those breaking rules around what they should and shouldn't be doing to support young people in the best way possible, and how then policy or legislation should be developed? Any thoughts on that?
Well, in my work, working with a lot of very frontline workers, and exactly that, it is kind of funny that I teach in a social work school. We never teach things like, and how do you ask for personal favors from other professionals to leverage services for the kids that are in your care, which is actually a thing we all do. And how do you basically get around a supervisor who's too rule focused? We never teach that skill either. And and how do you sort of scam resources out of the services for the kids that you really know need them at that particular moment? We don't teach any of that. And in fact, that's mostly what practice looks like in the real world. So I really hats off to the workers I know who have, in a sense, Melanie, your point is about, that the child's resilience is tied up with the system's resilience. So as long as we can encourage, I really like when, the way I like to say it is, policy directives come down, but I found some of the best things that I've ever done in my career have been to work with the people at the very front lines, trial a new idea, a new approach that's innovative and creative and crazy and everything else, and then prove to the superiors that it solved a problem for the agency. That child used fewer services, or just frankly was less of a, can I say, pain in the ass to the workers. I mean, they just, let's face it, some kids are really difficult to work with, right? And suddenly they're, oh my gosh, I'm not carrying that same kid back in my home every single night when I'm thinking about them, right? Like little tiny things. I talk about my own kids a little bit that way too, by the way. But it's that idea of that, if we can sometimes solve problems right at the very low, then you get a template for what might be replicable across an entire agency. But it really does take empowering workers on the front lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, I think things need to be youth-centered, and they're currently not. It's very top-down. Decisions are being made, on behalf or for, instead of with. And I think that needs to really change. I think government can learn a lot from young people who have lived experience in the system. And I think they should be centering policy development around those experiences. So partnering up with youth and care networks which have that capacity to inform government on how to reform legislation, how to change programs and services. In New Brunswick, we had youth and care hearings. I think there was a second one that happened a few years ago, but in my time in New Brunswick, I took part of the very first one in 2012. I was one of the speakers presenting my own lived experience alongside 5 others from the network to the Premier, to the Minister, to the Child and Youth Advocate, and a lot of top officials and key players in government. And those types of events and opportunities to speak, we were speaking in the legislature, in the provincial legislature for a whole day. And it really made a huge impact on how things progressed in terms of change and collaboration with the Youth and Care Network and the ministry. So I think those types of events need to be encouraged across the country, because it allows top officials who are disconnected from the realities of what it's like to be a foster kid, to age out. They get that first-hand account, and it really shakes them up and makes them realize that things have to change. So stories can have a really huge impact on policy change. I also think that there needs to be training and change management when it comes to reform happening from the top down. So that's why, like, for example, the moratoriums, we're seeing the directives happening from the top, and it's not translated to the front line, is because there was no real training, there was no guidance offered. And I think that has to happen in any new initiative, in any systemic reform initiative. There has to be a training component, and the training has to be trauma informed, because that's the thing that I've noticed, is that it shifts workers from thinking, oh, this young person is difficult to work with, to, oh, this young person is experiencing trauma, and I need to be able to support them in the way that they need me to, instead of being, oh, this person's defiant or removed or not collaborating. I think trauma-informed training is really important in terms of working with young people from care as well. So just a few things.
Yeah, great. I've got another question around the SROI work that's coming out of the Fostering Change work in BC. Can either of you speak to that, Dr. Doucette, perhaps? Are you familiar with that work?
What's the SROI? Sorry.
The social return on investment.
Oh, yes. So like the cost benefit analysis that they did. Yeah. So I think, government also listens to money. I think some governments empower more than others, but I think when you can showcase that investing in young people is worth it financially for the government, short-term and long-term, as well as like societal impact. Like there's so much benefit to investing in young people, as a preventative measure, instead of waiting until they're in crisis and falling through the cracks. That costs a lot more, and not just financially, and so many other aspects as well. So I do think that cost-benefit analysis are important, but they have been done. They've been done. We don't need to do any more. Like there was one done in Ontario, I think called 25 is the new 21 or something like that, and where they showed like extending care up until age 25, had a return on investment that was significant for the government of Ontario. There's been similar ones done in BC. So I don't think we need to do them again. Like they've been done. It's been shown that it's financially worth it to invest in young people. So I think now it's the time to move to action. Like I'm tired of talking and talking and talking when all the evidence is there. The solutions have been presented. Young people have been saying how things should be working and that things are not working for them as they are right now. It's time to listen, time to move to action.
Dr. Unger?
I think Melanie just captured it really well. The only thing I'll add is I think there's another aspect of this beyond the SRI, which is also, I don't think many workers I'll just shift the conversation from the focus on the youth to a little bit to the professionals actually working in the field as well. I'd be hard pressed to know if workers themselves know about the outcomes that they're producing. Like, how many workers on the front
Right.
lines of the child welfare system in Canada could honestly say that I know that of the kids I've worked with over the last, X number of years, so many have ended up in precarious housing, or so many have successfully engaged in post-secondary education. If that data would somebody please send it to me? Because I haven't really seen it at that kind of agency outcome level, like where the evaluation continues for the next, say, 3 years after, where they're disengaging, which kind of would also raise the question about, do we actually know which kids we should be taking into care? Right now, it feels like it's a little bit driven by legal mandates and sort of blanket policies. But I also sometimes worry, and I don't know if it's allowed to say or not, but heck, whatever, that I sometimes worry that, are we always justified, or is what we're providing kids in terms of care actually getting a better developmental outcome than even the child's in a risky or potentially even dangerous environment? And that seems to be a question that we just have no stomach to actually ask. And partly we don't have the data to know which profile of child that we remove from, depending on what kind of system we have to offer to them, actually produces an outcome which is better than the dangerous home environment that they were already in. And that seems to be just, because we're really talking about pathways here, we don't have the information. And I think workers are left then to make these decisions. And I don't think they feel great. Or many of the workers I speak with don't always feel great about the outcomes that they have intuitively known.
Your point, Dr. Unger, I know that surely by the nature of the human beings who are in this work, they do remain connected to young people who transition. And so I think there probably is anecdotal data around how well young people do and how poorly they do. But anecdotal data it is. So we do need to sort of reach a closure to the discussion. We've got 2 minutes left, and we do have a series of more questions in the Q&A, which I will commit to getting back to you on. I'll engage both of our panelists in creating some dialogue around this, and then we'll get it back to each of you. So thank you for those questions. And on behalf of Away Home Canada, Making the Shift Inc., and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, I want to thank both panelists for being here today, sharing of your knowledge and your wisdom and your experiences in helping shape this discussion. This isn't the end of the discussion. There are many more of these to follow, and I look forward to those with both of you. I will turn it back to April and Teresa.
Great, thanks so much. And I just want to echo what David just mentioned. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And I know that there has been a lot of lively chat in the background as well from our participants. And if we did not get to your question today, we will be sending your questions to our panelists for a follow-up conversation, hopefully in the form of a blog post. So thank you for all of your engagement, everybody. And we will be sending a recording of the session today too to all registrants. And today was our 4th In Conversation series. And if you have any feedback on our event, we'd love to hear from you in our post-event survey, and we're sharing it in the webinar chat. And again, if you'd like to learn more about our work, visit us at makingtheshiftinc.ca or subscribe to our newsletter in the chat. And this, again, was just so wonderful. I was personally very inspired by this as well. And I can speak on behalf of everyone that attended today as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Unger and Dr. Doucette, for your time today, and for David for facilitating.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy your weekends.
Thank you.